Hello, my name is Keegan Ballantyne, and along with my group members, Doug Williams, Carina Kane, and Grey Singh, we worked under Drs. Oz Amram and Kevin Pedro with Fermilab in machine learning-based simulations of particle collisions. To start with the problem setup, let's go over the idea of particle physics. So for decades, physicists have experimented in looking within the basic elements of atoms to understand the fundamental nature of the universe, which led to the standard model that theorizes what makes up our basic particles and their interactions. However, the invention of particle accelerators have allowed researchers to make huge advancements in the field and test the standard model. And testing the standard model theory in any way possible is the overarching goal of particle physics. So to talk about the anatomy of these colliders, they're essentially collision chambers surrounded by layers of sensors. And after colliding particles at very high speeds, these sensors can record measurements on deposited energy and some directionality of these flying particles. And the calorimeters are the sensors that pick up the most energy over time. So another approach to look at this phenomena is to computationally build simulations of collider particle showers that simulate the deposited energies and the directionalities as detected in calorimeters based off of the current knowledge from the standard model theory. And any significant differences between these simulation outputs and experimental collider data can highlight gaps within the standard model theory. Physicists can then update simulations based on these new theories to match the phenomena from the experimental data. And the most current example of this in action is the discovery of the Higgs boson in the right-hand side image. However, the biggest limitation of this current methodology is that these simulations, which are Monte Carlo-based, use up the vast majority of computational resources. And the right plot shows this as a time clock of CPU hours used to conduct ATLAS, in an example of a calorimeter simulation project. And 38% of the CPU hours are used for actual Monte Carlo simulations for the whole workflow, which is shown in blue and outlined in red. And this essentially makes it an easy target for us for optimization to increase efficiency and speed.
Now let's get I'll hand our approach. So the task we've been given is starting with some information about a particle, specifically what kind of particle it is and its initial energy entering the calorimeter. We want to be able to understand and simulate what the resulting energy shower looks like. This can actually be retooled as a generative task. Specifically, starting with those initial conditions, we can generate what this simulated shower will look like. The best generative models on the market right now are diffusion models, and a trained one, as you can see in the bottom, starts with an image of complete random noise and iteratively denoises it to an image that matches the initial distribution the model was trained on, in this context, cute dogs. There's already been work showing that trained diffusion models on these energy showers can simulate and generate really accurate energy showers for application. The downside is this generation process is still too small for us in the real world. Before getting into how we're speeding that up, let's talk a little bit about the data we're working with. So as mentioned before, a calorimeter is essentially an array of sensors within a cylindrical collision chamber. We can divide this cylinder into a series of 3D slices, which are each circular, as seen in the bottom right. You notice there are these little rectangles. Each rectangle is essentially a chunk of 3D space, which has one sensor responsible for it. The colors here are indicating how much energy that sensor has detected. The brighter the color, the more energy detected. So when we're saying we're simulating these energy showers, what we really mean is we're generating a series of these circular images, which each show the distribution of energy detected, and then we can stack them all on top of each other to recreate the full calorimeter. Let's talk a little bit about inference now. So once we have one of these trained diffusion models, we can generate these circular images and then iteratively denoise from a noisy image on the far left to a properly denoised image of what our shower should look like. But this process can be very slow, specifically because the images we're working with are very high resolution. As you can kind of see here, there are potentially thousands of these sensors within a calorimeter, and so it can be a slow process. To speed it up, we're going to be using what's called latent diffusion. Latent diffusion speeds things up by performing the diffusion process on a smaller latent space. You'll see in the middle here, we're doing our diffusion process, but on these smaller images. In order to map between the smaller latent space and the original data space, we train an autoencoder ahead of time. This autoencoder then allows us to take the original resolution noised image, encode it into a smaller image, do the diffusion process rapidly on it, decode it, and then get out our final output. Now, as you can imagine, this pre-trained autoencoder and its accuracy is critical to this process, so I'm going to pass things over to Grey, who's going to explain how we ensured that accuracy.
All right, so on to the autoencoder results. So autoencoder accuracy compression trade-off. Now, before I get into this trade-off here, I'm going to give a bit of background about autoencoders. An autoencoder is a neural network used to learn encodings of unlabeled data. So what does that mean? Well, you can kind of see the general idea in this image here. There is an encoding step that reduces the dimensionality of some input data, and a decoding step that recreates the input data from the compressed representation, also called the latent representation. So an ideal autoencoder could encode some data perfectly down to a very small compressed representation. But the problem is the more you encode, that is, the more you compress some set of data, the harder it is to reconstruct. And that is the trade-off between accuracy and compression. So what we really want to do here is pick a set of hyperparameters for our autoencoder that maximize the compression factor while also maximizing the reconstructability of the data. So here in this graph, we have some autoencoder evaluation results. Each of these points is a different hyperparameter configuration, and FPD on the y-axis over there stands for Frechet physics distance. It is basically a metric for reconstructability, and all you really need to know is that lower is better. And then we have compression factor at the bottom. Higher is better because we want more compression. And now you can see some red circles there. Those are the 3 models we selected for diffusion. So why do we select those? Well, again, this is trade-off, right? So basically, because that is the best reconstructability we could get while still having decent compression. And now I'm going to hand things off to Carina.
So another way that we wanted to evaluate these autoencoders is visualizing the latent space of the autoencoder. So we're working with inherently very high dimensional data. For reference, each sample is batch sized by 45 by 9 by 16 voxels. And our autoencoder is tasked then with learning high dimensional patterns within this data. But we can ask the question of how good are the patterns that it's learning? Right now, we have an evaluation script that uses various numerical metrics to compare our data to the real data using various distributions. But our thought was that using visual representations of this data and of the data that passes through the autoencoder into the latent space might be able to reveal more information that we can leverage to improve our autoencoder model. So one of the current pipelines that we've built is a PCA pipeline. And this pipeline essentially takes the latent space data and allows us to compare it to the raw data in terms of estimating the dimensionality and the number of important variables that can explain variation within these sets of data. So on the right here, you can see 2 plots. The first one looks at the explained variance in the encoded data per PCA component. And the one below it is looking at the raw data and comparing the first and the second PCA components. These visualizations, along with many others, can help us holistically understand what this latent space looks like and how it relates to our raw data to give us a better understanding of how well our autoencoder works.
So as Carina mentioned, we have some other processes that can evaluate both the latent diffusion models as well as the autoencoders on a distributional level. To understand what I mean by distributional level, it's important to note that taking 2 particles, colliding them into each other, and then measuring the energies is an inherently random process. You're never going to get the same energy readings twice. What that means is that if I do a simulation using one of our slow but very accurate Monte Carlo processes, and then do one using our latent diffusion pipeline, they're never going to line up perfectly. So we can't just do one-to-one comparisons to evaluate the accuracy of our methods. In order to do this, we want to look to see if the aggregate statistical properties of the Monte Carlo simulation match the aggregate statistical properties of our diffusion model. To do this, we're going to be looking at, as Carina mentioned, distributions rather than one-to-one comparisons. And on the right, you're going to see one example of these. Here on the x-axis, you're going to see the layer number, which is effectively which slice we have ordered, and then the mean deposited energy or average energy that was detected in that slice. Now, you're going to notice that there's 2 lines, a dotted line, which is representing GNT4, or the current Monte Carlo simulation, which is very slow but very accurate. The dark blue line is representing a diffusion model. What we want is for the dark blue line to almost perfectly overlap with the dotted line. If this is the case, it means that our models are just as accurate as the Monte Carlo simulation while also being faster. I'm going to pass things over to Grey, who's going to show another one of these.
All right, so here are some of our plots for layer energy distribution. Specifically, these are normalized histograms of simulated energies for a specific slice, which is layer 14. So what do these tell us? Well, in this case, the GANT4 distribution here is basically the ideal target distribution for generated data that we want from our models. So on the left here, you can see that our autoencoder model with compression factor 6, which is labeled Kaloenko in the plot, does relatively well. That is, its simulated distribution isn't too far off from the ideal. And on the right, it does not do quite as well. And I'm sure that you can guess that that is primarily a result of the compression factor. Remember, a higher compression factor means more compression, which means less data reconstructability. And so our layer energy distribution suffers for it.
All right. In terms of wrapping up with a summary and discussion, first, we can just go over the overarching deliverables from this project. And first, we've successfully trained and evaluated an autoencoder and created a pipeline for the evaluation and training scripts, as well as created autoencoder evaluations for varying compression factors. And then finally, we also produce a latent diffusion training and evaluation pipeline in order for researchers to explore and look at the data with the goal in mind of increasing sampling speed while maintaining high accuracy in diffusion modeling by encoding data into a latent space representation. And this essentially outlines our progress this quarter. And thank you for listening. And we hope you enjoyed hearing about our project for the Data Science Clinic.